The world of gospel music has seen many talented artists who, for various reasons, stepped away from the spotlight and were never seen again. Some left due to personal struggles, shifts in career paths, or undisclosed circumstances. Here are 19 gospel legends who vanished and were never seen again. 1.
On my knees and gave me a song when I couldn't stop crying. He was teaching me how.
Dottie Rambo was one of the most beloved figures in gospel music, a woman whose songs became hymns and whose voice carried the power of faith to millions. For over 5 decades, she wrote and sang some of the most enduring gospel standards, from We Shall Behold to Shelter in the Arms of God. Yet her final year was marked by quiet struggles that made her sudden death feel even more tragic. By 2007, though she still performed with the same fiery spirit, those close to her knew she was facing hardships. Gospel music, for all its spiritual uplift, could be a brutal business, especially for artists who didn't always get the royalties or respect they deserved. Rumors swirled that people she had trusted, industry insiders, collaborators, had taken advantage of her kindness, leaving her in financial strain even as she continued to tour and minister. Then, on May 11, 2008, the unthinkable happened. Her tour bus crashed on a Missouri highway, and she was killed instantly. The news devastated the gospel world. Here was a woman who had sung for presidents, who had written songs that would outlive her by generations, gone in a moment. The shock was compounded by the realization that her last days had been shadowed by struggle when they should have been filled with honor. 2. Vestal Goodman, the undisputed queen of gospel music, spent decades filling churches and concert halls with her powerhouse voice and infectious spirit. As a matriarch of the Happy Goodman family, she helped shape Southern gospel music with timeless performances and a personality as big as her voice. But in her final years, the woman who once commanded stages with electrifying energy quietly stepped away from the spotlight, leaving fans to wonder about the beloved singer who had brought them so much joy. By the early 2000s, Vestal's health had begun to decline. The woman who had once belted out, "I wouldn't take nothing for my journey now," with unmatched fervor, was now facing the physical toll of a lifetime of touring. She made fewer public appearances, and when she did, it was clear that her strength wasn't what it used to be. Yet even in those fading years, those close to her said her faith never wavered. She just no longer had the stamina for the road. When she passed away on December 27, 2003, the gospel world mourned not just her death, but the quiet way she had slipped from view in those final years. There were no grand farewell tours, no dramatic last performances, just a gradual retreat from the stage she had once dominated. In a way, it was fitting for a woman whose music had always been about genuine faith rather than spectacle. 3.
A lot on my own.
The quiet exit of Jesse Dixon, a gospel star who faded too soon. Jesse Dixon's voice was a force of nature, a soaring instrument that bridged gospel, pop, and soul with effortless grace. The Chicago-born singer made history when Paul Simon handpicked him for the groundbreaking Live Ryman tour in the 1970s, introducing his powerhouse vocals to mainstream audiences. Yet despite his towering talent and crossover appeal, Dixon's final years unfolded in heartbreaking quietness. His departure from music as understated as his impact had been profound. By the late 2000s, fans began noticing something troubling. Their beloved gospel crooner was disappearing. The man who once shared stages with Simon and recorded with some of music's biggest names was gradually retreating from public life. Concert dates dried up. New recordings ceased. The vibrant performer who delivered electrifying renditions of I Am Redeemed and Operator seemed to vanish into silence. When Dixon passed away on September 26, 2011, the muted response spoke volumes. For an artist of his caliber, a 5-time Grammy nominee and gospel music ambassador, the lack of widespread tribute felt jarring. Industry insiders whispered about health struggles, but concrete details remained scarce. The man who had once filled arenas with his joyous energy left this world with little fanfare, his final years shrouded in mystery. For
my life at a very early age, and now God has taken us to about 40 different countries of the world.
The disappearing act of Andre Crouch, gospel's reluctant legend, Andre Crouch, who had been impossible to miss. A 6 feet 4 inches musical giant who reshaped gospel music with his contemporary chords and crossover appeal. The man who gave us "The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power" and "My Tribute" became so influential that Michael Jackson and Madonna sought his studio magic. Yet throughout his 5-decade career, Crouch kept vanishing at the height of his fame, leaving fans and collaborators bewildered by his sudden absences. The pattern began in the 1970s, just as his group, the Disciples, were revolutionizing gospel with their R&B infused sound. Crouch would disappear for months. Recording sessions got canceled. Tours were postponed. Industry whispers suggested personal demons and spiritual exhaustion were blamed, though Crouch himself remained characteristically quiet about his struggles. His most dramatic vanishing act came after his 1994 Grammy win for "Mercy." At what should have been his career peak, Crouch retreated to his Los Angeles home, turning down high-profile opportunities. For years, the gospel innovator who had collaborated with Elvis and Quincy Jones became nearly invisible, surfacing only for occasional choir workshops or Sunday sermons at his small church. When he re-emerged in the 2010s for a final creative surge, including work on Disney's A Lion King soundtrack, longtime observers noted how much the constant disappearances had cost him. The man who pioneered contemporary gospel found himself overshadowed by younger artists he'd influenced. 5.
How sweet, sweeter than honey, said it's sweeter than honey.
The silent retreat of Rance Allen. When a gospel titan walked away, Rance Allen didn't just sing gospel, he rewrote its DNA, fusing holy fire with funky grooves in a way that made the church shout and the nightclub nod in agreement. His blistering falsetto on classics like "Ain't No Need of Crying" and "Miracle Worker" bridged the sacred and secular worlds, influencing generations of singers from gospel to soul to R&B. Yet in his final years, one of music's most electrifying voices chose to exit stage, left with barely a whisper. The fade-out began gradually in the 2010s. Tour dates became sporadic. The man who once tore the roof off venues with his 4-octave range started declining high-profile festival appearances, while other legends of his era mounted farewell tours. Allen simply stepped back. There was no dramatic announcement, no tearful final concert, just a quiet recalibration of priorities that left fans reading between the lines. Those close to him understood. After 50 years of ministry through music, after pioneering the very sound of contemporary gospel, after surviving industry changes that sidelined many of his peers, Bishop Allen had earned a right to focus on his Toledo church and personal well-being. The same man who could shatter microphones with his vocal runs now preferred intimate Sunday sermons over spotlight moments. 6.
Has turned upside down.
Tramaine Hawkins, the gospel star who crossed over and lost her way. There was a time in the early 1980s when Tramaine Hawkins stood unrivaled as gospel music's brightest star. Her voice, a soaring, soulful instrument, delivered era-defining hits like "Change" and "Fall Down" that dominated church choirs and Billboard charts alike. Then, at the height of her fame, she made a decision that would haunt her career for decades. She walked away from gospel music. The move to secular music in the mid-1980s shocked the faithful. Hawkins, who had risen to the ranks of the Edwin Hawkins Singers and become a sought-after solo artist, suddenly found herself recording pop and dance tracks. The backlash was swift and brutal. Gospel radio stations pulled her music. Former fans accused her of abandoning the church. Though she scored minor R&B success with songs like "Love Explosion," the magic of her gospel work was conspicuously absent. When Hawkins returned to gospel in the 1990s with the Grammy-winning The Potter's House, the reunion felt bittersweet. While she reclaimed her throne as one of the genre's great voices, some argued she never quite recaptured the cultural dominance of her early years. The industry had moved on, and new stars had risen in her absence. 7. The vanishing act of the Clark Sisters' original members. The Clark Sisters revolutionized gospel music with their fiery harmonies and charismatic performances, creating a legacy that continues to influence generations. But while names like Twinkie, Karen, and Dorinda Clark remain familiar to fans, Some of the group's original members faded into near total obscurity. Their departure so quiet that many listeners today don't even realize they're missing. Jackie Clark Chisholm, one of the founding members and the eldest sister, stepped away from the spotlight long before the group's resurgence in the 2000s. Unlike her sisters, who pursued solo careers or high-profile ministry work, Jackie retreated into private life with no interviews, no comeback tours, and no explanation. The woman who once shared lead vocals on early Clark Sisters classics simply vanished from stages, leaving fans to wonder why such a pivotal voice in gospel history chose silence. Even more mysterious is the absence of Denise Clark Bradford, another original member who left the group in the 1980s. Unlike Jackie, Denise briefly attempted a solo career before disappearing completely. No social media, no guest appearances, no reunion performances. Rumors swirled about health struggles or personal conflicts, but the truth remains locked away in family privacy. Their disappearances raise haunting questions about gospel music's unspoken pressures. Was it the exhaustion of life on the road, the weight of living up to the Clark name, or simply a desire to walk away from the scrutiny of fame? 8.
My peace, I said it makes me.
The quiet exit of Walter Hawkins, a gospel legend's final retreat. Walter Hawkins didn't just make gospel music, he reinvented it. As the architect behind the love-centered church sound and timeless classics like Going Up Yonder and Change, his influence stretched far beyond the church walls, shaping everyone from R&B singers to hip-hop producers. Yet in his final years, the man whose music once electrified crowds became increasingly withdrawn, leaving fans to wonder about the reclusive final chapter of one of gospel's greatest minds. The change came gradually. Where Bishop Hawkins had once been a constant presence at gospel festivals and television specials, by the mid-2000s, he began declining nearly all public appearances. The energetic director who led mass choirs with boundless passion now preferred the quiet of his Oakland sanctuary over the roar of adoring crowds. Industry colleagues received polite refusals instead of the enthusiastic collaborations they'd come to expect. Those closest to him understood this retreat wasn't about fading talent. Even in his final years, Hawkins' musical genius remained sharp. Rather, it seemed a conscious choice to focus on pastoring his flock and battling the illness that would eventually claim him. The man who'd spent decades giving his voice to the world appeared determined to spend his remaining time nurturing the local community that had birthed his legacy. 9. The disappearing women of the Caravans, gospel's lost pioneers. When people talk about the Caravans, the conversation usually starts and often ends with Shirley Caesar. But behind the legendary singer stood a sisterhood of powerhouse vocalists who helped define gospel's golden era, only to vanish from music history like ghosts in the choir loft. The Caravans weren't just a group. They were a finishing school for gospel greatness. Bessie Griffin left to become the Empress of Gospel in her own right before fading into obscurity. Dorothy Norwood launched a solo career with hits like Denied Mother, then stepped away at her peak. Even Albertina Walker, who kept the group alive for decades, watched as original members like Dolores Washington and Cassietta George quietly exited stage left, their incredible voices disappearing from recordings and revivals. What makes these disappearances so haunting is how deliberate they seem. Unlike male gospel groups whose departures often came with dramatic announcements, the Caravans' women simply stopped singing. No farewell tours, no tell-all interviews, just empty spaces where monumental voices once stood. Some left for marriage, others for teaching or local ministry. A few, like the transcendent Inez Andrews, enjoyed late career resurgences, but most became footnotes in Shirley Caesar's legendary story. Their absence created a peculiar silence in gospel, a genre built on female voices suddenly missing its founding mothers. 10.
No, don't get you ready. I'll take you there.
The Winans who walked away, gospel's first family's missing voices. The Winans dynasty stands as gospel music's royal family, their harmonies soundtracking the faith of generations. But behind the glittering success of BB, CeCe, Marvin, and the rest, there exists a shadow history. The original Winans members who chose to leave the stage completely. their voices fading into quiet anonymity. Before Let My People Go made them household names, the Winans were just another talented Detroit family singing at local churches. Some of those earliest members, names now lost to all but the most devoted fans, stepped away before fame arrived. Unlike their siblings who became gospel superstars, these Winans chose ordinary lives, pastoring small congregations, working regular jobs, disappearing into the rhythm of family and faith without microphones or spotlights. Even more striking are those who left after tasting success. While Ronald and Carvin Winans became core members of the Winans, others from their generation quietly exited the industry at its peak. No dramatic fallouts, no tabloid stories, just a decision to trade stadiums for living rooms, platinum records for Sunday morning pulpits. 11. The vanishing voices of Thomas Whitfield's legacy. When Thomas Whitfield died suddenly at 38, gospel music didn't just lose its greatest innovator. It lost an entire musical universe. The architect of the Whitfield sound left behind more than timeless compositions like We Need a Word from the Lord and I'm Encouraged. His sudden passing in 1992 scattered the brilliant collaborators who helped create his signature style, many of whom vanished from music entirely. The Whitfield singers weren't just background vocalists. They were his musical laboratory. Artists like Gwen Fox, who delivered the heart-stopping lead on Precious Jesus, and Charles Woolfolk, whose bass lines anchored the sound, simply disappeared from recordings after Whitfield's death. The new Tommy's Community Choir, which had been shaping modern gospel, dissolved into silence. Some retreats were understandable. How do you follow the irreplaceable? Others seemed more mysterious. Singers who had been on the verge of solo careers stepped away completely. Musicians who defined an era took local church jobs or left music altogether. The tight-knit musical family Whitfield built scattered like leaves of a storm. Today, as choirs still struggle to replicate Whitfield's complex arrangements, the absence of his core collaborators feels particularly haunting. Their voices shaped a revolution in gospel music, then faded into history without explanation. In an industry that loves comebacks and reunions, the silence from Whitfield's musical children remained profound, a missing piece in the story of contemporary gospel's evolution. The mystery endures. Did they leave because no one could replace their maestro, or because the music business had no place for them without Whitfield's genius to spotlight their talents? Whatever the reason, their disappearance remains one of gospel's great unsolved mysteries, a chorus of voices that should still be
God has prepared.
The disappearing choir. What happened to Brunson's legendary singers? Reverend Milton Brunson and the Thompson Community Singers didn't just make music. They defined an era of gospel. For over 4 decades, their powerhouse harmonies on classics like Safe in His Arms and I'm Still Here set the standard for mass choir excellence. But when Brunson passed in 1997, something unexpected happened. His legendary ensemble didn't just lose their leader, they vanished from the spotlight almost entirely. The Thompson Community Singers have been more than a choir. They were a training ground for gospel's finest. Yet after Brunson's death, the group that once packed churches and dominated radio playlists simply dissolved. No farewell tour, no next generation revival, just silence where there had once been roof-raising praise. Some members, like lead singer Orlando Draper, briefly carried the torch before their own untimely deaths. Others quietly returned to their Chicago church roots, their world-class voices now heard only in local Sunday morning services. A few, like the dynamic Vanessa Bell Armstrong, transitioned to solo work, but without the fiery ensemble behind them. Even star singers found the landscape had changed. The industry moved on quickly. New choirs emerged. Tastes shifted. But for those who remember the sheer force of Brunson's choir in full cry, the absence left a gap no other group could fill. Today, their recordings remain gospel essentials, but the voices behind them have faded into anonymity. It's a haunting lesson in how quickly musical legacies can scatter, even those that once seemed too mighty to ever be silenced. The Thompson Community Singers didn't just lose their director. Gospel music lost an institution, one voice at a time. 13.
Oh, hallelujah. Child, come right on in.
The Barrett sisters' silent exit, gospel's most graceful goodbye. For 50 years, the Barrett sisters, Rhodessa, Deloise, and Billy, represented the gold standard of gospel harmony. Their crystalline blend on classics like Jesus Will and Mary, Don't You Weep, earned them a permanent place in music history. Then, with the same quiet dignity that characterized their performances, they simply walked away. Unlike most gospel legends who announce farewell tours or transition into elder stateswomen roles, the Barrett's retirement came without ceremony. One year they were accepting Lifetime Achievement Awards. The next they had vanished from the circuit completely. No final concerts. No interviews reflecting on their legacy. Just 3 microphones set down for good. Their disappearance felt particularly striking given their Chicago roots in the heart of gospel's most vibrant community. The sisters, who had been fixtures at churches and workshops across the city, suddenly became spectral figures, remembered but rarely seen. Younger artists who hoped to learn from them found only their recordings as teachers. This quiet ending perfectly matched their career. The Barretts had never courted fame, only excellence. They sang not for accolades, but because they could not sing. When the time came to stop, they did so with the same understated grace that had defined their ministry. Today, their absence speaks louder than any comeback ever could. In an age where every artist wants one more curtain call, the Barrett sisters' silent exit stands as their final masterclass. Sometimes the most powerful testimony is knowing when the song should end. 14.
Father, remember me.
The forgotten voices of the Soul Stirrers. When Sam Cooke left the Soul Stirrers in 1957 to pursue pop stardom, the legendary gospel quartet didn't just lose their lead singer, they lost their place in history's spotlight. While Cooke became a household name, the men who kept the Soul Stirrers alive faded into near total obscurity, their contributions largely erased from music's collective memory. Johnny Taylor stepped into Cooke's impossible shoes first, delivering electrifying performances on songs like Somewhere to Lay My Head. But after Taylor's own departure for secular success, a revolving door of talented vocalists, R.H. Harris, Martin J. Cox, Willie Rogers, passed through the group with little fanfare. These weren't backup singers. They were powerhouse vocalists who maintained the Soul Stirrers standard of excellence through the 1960s and beyond. Yet today, even devoted gospel fans struggle to name them. The disappearances were gradual but complete. Some members quit music entirely, taking factory jobs or driving trucks. Others joined small church choirs where their golden voices were heard by dozens rather than thousands. A few, like the great Paul Foster, continue performing but without the recognition they'd known during the group's heyday. What makes these vanishings particularly poignant is how they mirror the fate of so many black artists of the era. Brilliant performers who shaped American music but never received their due. The Soul Stirrers kept singing, kept touring, kept making records long after Cooke left. But without the bright lights of crossover success, history forgot the men who preserved the legacy. Today, when we listen to post-Cooke Soul Stirrers recordings, we hear ghosts, extraordinary voices floating in time, disconnected from the faces and stories that should have made them immortal. Their disappearance stands as one of gospel music's great quiet tragedies. Sometimes keeping the flame burning means being consumed by its smoke. 15. Vanessa Bell Armstrong's mysterious retreat. At the peak of her career, Vanessa Bell Armstrong stood as one of gospel music's most electrifying voices, a powerhouse singer whose emotive delivery on classics like Peace Be Still and You Bring Out the Best in Me cemented her status among the greats. Then, just as suddenly as she had burst onto the scene, Armstrong began stepping back, her once constant presence in the gospel world fading like the final notes of a Sunday morning benediction. The change came gradually in the 2010s. Festival lineups that had regularly featured her name started appearing without it. New music became scarce. The singer who had once collaborated with everyone from Whitney Houston to R. Kelly now seemed content to let her legendary catalog speak for itself. Unlike many artists who announced retirement, Armstrong's withdrawal was marked by silence. No press releases, no farewell tours, just an unmistakable absence where one of gospel's brightest lights had once shone. Fans speculated about health issues or personal struggles, but Armstrong maintained her privacy. Occasionally she would surface, a guest appearance here, a tribute concert there, but these moments only deepened the mystery. How could a voice that big choose silence? In truth, Armstrong's quiet exit may be her most powerful statement. In an era of constant self-promotion, she demonstrated that some artists don't need the spotlight to validate their legacy. The music remains, still shaking church pews, still comforting broken hearts, still testifying to the glory she sang about all those years. Vanessa Bell Armstrong didn't disappear. She simply let her life's work speak for her. 16.
You need a friend. No one can be found.
The vanishing pillars of the mighty clouds of joy. When people talk about the mighty clouds of joy today, they usually mention Joe Ligon, the dynamic frontman whose raspy, preaching delivery became their signature sound. But the group's foundation was built by men whose names have largely been forgotten, voices that shaped gospel quartet music before fading into the shadows of history. Original members like Johnny Martin and Richard Wallace didn't just sing background. They created the blueprint for modern gospel harmony. Wallace's smooth baritone anchored early hits like Steal Away to Jesus, while Martin's arrangements brought sophisticated jazz influences to sanctified singing. Yet by the 1980s, both had vanished from the lineup without ceremony. No farewell tours, no tribute albums, just empty spaces where monumental voices once stood. The disappearances grew more tragic as years passed. Elmo Franklin, another founding member, died in obscurity in 2008. His contributions rarely acknowledged during the group's later triumphs. Willie Joe Ligon, no relation to Joe, simply stopped showing up for tours one year, his whereabouts becoming gospel music's unanswered question. What makes these vanishings particularly haunting is how they reflect gospel's fragile memory. The mighty cloud became icons, but the men who built their sound were erased from the story. Today, when young artists sample their classic recordings, they're hearing ghosts, voices preserved on wax but lost time, men who helped invent contemporary gospel only to disappear into its shadows. Their absence speaks to a deeper truth. In music history, sometimes the architects get remembered while the builders get forgotten. The mighty clouds still fly, but some of the voices that first lifted them up have drifted away like morning mist. 17. The forgotten voices of the Dixie Hummingbirds. For over 9 decades, the Dixie Hummingbirds soared as one of gospel music's most influential groups, their intricate harmonies shaping everything from doo-wop to modern gospel. But behind the longevity of this legendary group lies a quieter story. The original members who vanished at the height of their fame, their departures so understated that even devoted fans barely noticed. When people think of the Hummingbirds, names like Ira Tucker and James Davis come to mind, the dynamic leaders who propelled the group to stardom. But what about the others? Beachy Thompson, whose tenor floated effortlessly above the harmonies on early recordings, simply walked away in the 1950s. Barney Parks, whose bass anchored their signature sound, retired to a quiet life in Philadelphia without ceremony. These weren't backup singers. They were architects of a revolutionary sound that would influence generations. The disappearances happened gradually, almost politely. No dramatic exits, no public feuds. Just men who one day stopped showing up for tours and recording sessions, their absence explained with a simple "he's moved on." Even as the group continued performing well into the 21st century, the contributions of these original members faded from memory. Today, when scholars trace the evolution of gospel quartet singing, they encounter ghost stories, talented men who helped build an American art form before vanishing into obscurity. The Hummingbirds kept flying, but some of the wings that first lifted them up were quietly clipped by time. Their silent exits serve as a reminder. Not every musical pioneer gets a spotlight, but every harmony they created still echoes somewhere in the songs we love today. 18.
For my mother.
The fading hymn of Reverend James Moore. They called him the king of traditional gospel for good reason. Reverend James Moore's thunderous voice on classics like I Will Trust in the Lord and Jesus Christ is a Way define an era of unshakable, pulpit-shaking gospel music. Yet in his final years, the mighty voice that once filled stadiums fell silent in the most heartbreaking way. Not with triumph and farewell, but with a slow, quiet disappearance that left fans praying for just one more song. The change came gradually in the early 2010s. Concert cancellations piled up. The man who had recorded over 20 albums stopped releasing new music. Festival lineups that once featured Moore as a headliner moved his name to smaller print, then removed it altogether. By the time word leaked about his failing health, a years-long battle with kidney disease, Moore had already retreated from public view entirely. There was something particularly poignant about Moore's vanishing act. This was a singer who had belted "God is good all the time" with such conviction that audiences felt heaven itself was listening. Now, even his closest colleagues struggled to get updates on his condition. The industry that had celebrated him seemed to move on overnight, chasing younger artists while the king of the traditional sound faded in silence. When Moore passed in 2014, the tributes poured in, but many carried an unspoken regret. Why had such an essential voice been allowed to disappear before our ears? His absence revealed an uncomfortable truth about gospel music. Sometimes we don't realize we're hearing a legend's final notes until the microphone has already been turned off for good. Today, when choirs resurrect his songs, Moore's voice still comes through clear as a church bell, powerful, undeniable, and somehow still present even in his permanent absence. The music remains, but the silence around his final years lingers like a question mark at the end of a perfect hymn. 19. The mysterious disappearance of gospel's greatest voices. Gospel music has always been about making a joyful noise, but some of its most powerful voices left the stage in near silence. These artists didn't just retire, they vanished without explanation, leaving behind legions of heartbroken fans and unanswered questions. Take Keith Pringle, the dynamic force behind gospel classics like "There's a King in You." At the peak of his popularity in the 1990s, he simply walked away. No farewell tour, no final album, just empty space where one of gospel's most electrifying performers once stood. Those rare sightings at small churches only deepened the mystery. His voice still golden, his piano playing still masterful, yet he refused to reclaim his throne. Then there's Reverend James Moore, the king of traditional gospel, whose battle with kidney disease became a quiet, lonely struggle. The man who once shook stadiums with "I will trust in the Lord" spent his final years in painful obscurity. The industry that had celebrated him moved on while his health failed, leaving fans to wonder why such a monumental talent was allowed to fade away. The original members of legendary groups like the Dixie Hummingbirds and the Mighty Clouds of Joy disappeared even more completely. These weren't backup singers. They were architects of gospel's golden age who helped shape the sound of American music itself. Yet one by one, they retired without ceremony, their contributions gradually erased from history. Beachy Thompson's crystalline tenor? Gone. Richard Wallace's foundational bass lines? Forgotten. What makes these disappearances so haunting is the silence surrounding them. In other genres, artists get farewell tours, lifetime achievement awards, and biopics. But in gospel, too many legends simply vanish. Their absence noticed only by the most devoted fans. Perhaps it's the nature of sacred music, where humility often outweighs self-promotion. Or maybe it's the industry's tendency to focus on the next big thing rather than honor its pioneers.